We have three speakers. We have Ragnar Andersson from Karlstad University, and we have Karen Boyce from Ulster University, and we have Lynn Ranåker from the Region South Fire and Rescue Service, and also a member of the board in Brandfors. And just as yesterday, save your questions and reflections for last, and we will sum them up in the end of this theme. So welcome, Ragnar. You can start.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Should I say something about myself, or? Yeah, I'm a professor of risk management, senior professor of risk management at Karlstad University, as you can see. No, you cannot see. There you can see the logo. Senior professor means something like professor emeritus, which means that I retired some years ago, but I'm still employed by the university. That's why they call it senior researcher, senior professor. I'm not a fire prevention expert. My background is in public health, in occupational safety. I've done research in traffic safety, consumer safety, child safety, elderly safety, all fields of safety except fire safety, until just a few years ago when I got involved in fire safety as well. And I find it really very interesting and challenging, this field, and I'm happy to be able to contribute with some perspectives from parallel fields like the ones I just mentioned. But let me go to the theme then. Who are at risk? And I can say directly that the answer depends. It's twofold, because it depends on which particular risk we are talking about. If we are talking about the risk of fire, of having a fire, then we are all at risk. We often tend to point at certain groups and claim that they are careless. We blame them. But the fact is that we are all careless, just in various ways. Some of us are careless with cigarettes, others with candles, or with battery chargers, or with electronics, or with cooking appliances. There are many ways of being careless. So when it comes to the risk of having a fire, the distribution across population groups is surprisingly even. There is no clear tendency, and there is really no reason for blaming. If we are talking about the risk of dying or being seriously injured, the situation is totally opposite. We have a very skewed risk profile. An uneven distribution towards medical and socially vulnerable groups. And typical characteristics are upper ages, problem with health and disability, and also some social circumstances like poor economy, living alone, problematic consumption patterns with regard to alcohol, but also medicines like sleeping pills, tranquilizers, painkillers, and things like that, also often involved. Why do we have these differences in risk profile? Let me remind you about two very essential facts. First of all fires, almost at least, start as small fires, and small fires are easier to extinguish. And that is really what people seem to do. Most people seem to be able to manage and handle their fires themselves without assistance from outside. I will come back to that. And also, even small fires can be fatal. For example, clothing fires. If your clothes catch fire, you may get fatally injured in just a few seconds. It goes very fast. And if you have a smoldering fire in upholstered furniture, your living room or bedroom may be converted into a deadly gas chamber in a very short time due to the very toxic gases that are emitted. So there is really a very weak connection between fires that are threatening property and fires that are threatening people. And many of the fatal fires goes under the radar from the national authorities' point of view. They are not aware of them. Like people who die at hospital, for example. They are alive when they get out of the fire, but they die later from the injuries they get. They are not often excluded in the statistics. And also clothing fires, either unintentionally or intentional, also is a part of that. Suicide and suicide attempts. So, and this is another way, a more statistical way, to illustrate the situation. Accidents and injuries are often illustrated in the form of a pyramid, with the most severe cases at top and the least severe at the bottom. And it is estimated in Sweden that we have about 20,000 residential fires every year in Sweden, of which 5,000, about 25% of them, are attended by the rescue services. So the rest, 3/4 of the fires, are handled by the residents themselves, or they fade out without human action, maybe some of them. But anyway, so there is just a small proportion that is attended by the rescue services and that is included in statistics and so on. The rest of the fires we know very little about, but we know from this that people seem to be capable of handling their own fires to a large extent. And if you look at the injury side of the problem, there's just only 5% of the fires lead to an injury at all, even including minor injuries. And less than 1% of the fires result in fatalities, which means that more than 99% of all fires are non-fatal. And from this we can conclude two things. Most fires are handled by people themselves, and most people are capable of avoiding physical harm from fires. So how can we explain this, that some people are at risk of dying from fires or in fires, while all of us seem to be at risk of having a fire? What is the mechanism there? Then I would like to introduce you to the so-called Swiss cheese model presented by James Reason in the 1990s. The idea is to illustrate the principle of defense in depth, that we need several layers of defenses or protective measures, usually. So if one barrier fails, others should take over. For example, if you crash your car, your seatbelt or airbags or other shock-absorbing structures in your car or alongside the road are supposed to save your life anyway. This is how it works in more and more fields. The problems with, also the holes represent weaknesses. There are no perfect barriers in safety. They all have their weaknesses, and if the weaknesses coincide and interact, the accident trajectory may pass through all barriers and cause major damage anyway. So that is what this tries to illustrate. The problem with the weaknesses is that they tend to treat people unequally. And this is what I'm going to illustrate. So if we then look at what barriers we have in place when it comes to fire. First of all, we have the possibility of preventing the fire from occurring in the first place. This barrier, as I mentioned, is very equal. It treats us equally. We are at equal risk, fairly equal. The second barrier is to extinguish the fire at an early stage before it escalates out of control. And this, as we saw, is something that most people seem to manage. But if you are stuck in bed or in a wheelchair, or if you are seriously demented or have similar problems, you are at serious risk because you are very unlikely to manage this situation. The third barrier is to escape the fire. And again, the same categories are at elevated risk. They are unlikely to be able to do this themselves. The fourth barrier is to get rescued. And this barrier depends on alarming functions and also on response time from the rescue services. And if you have difficulties to alarm and don't really understand what's going on and so on, even this barrier will treat people unequally. And finally, we have the possibility of being cured. If we are rescued alive, then our survival chances depends on the quality of the health services we are subjected to. And again, this barrier also treat people unequally because people with lowered general health are less likely to survive a certain degree of trauma. So all these factors influence the final outcome in terms of deaths and injuries and disabilities, the kind of indices that we can see in statistics and we collect data on. So this leads to, most barriers show significant weaknesses with regard to the actual risk groups. That was the main message here. Leads to two conclusions. First of all, individual capacity is the key factor for survival. We can see that very clearly. Those with impaired capacities are at imminent risk due to cumulative causes, as I try to illustrate here. Secondly, over a lifespan, we are all at risk because we all grow older and are likely to end up in the risk group. So fire safety is not a matter of them, but of all of us. Thank you.
I brought my glasses and my watch here. I don't know whether I'll need both of them, but we'll see. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today, and thank you for the invitation to speak. My name's Karen Boyce. I've just pulled my belt off, which I need to hold up my speaker. My name is Karen Boyce and I work in Ulster University. I was interested yesterday to hear that Anna and a few others had worked in the field for over 20 years. I've been working in the University of Ulster for 31 years. So what I am going to do today, I hope within the next 15 minutes, is sort of condense some of the views that I've had in that time working in the area of evacuation and human behaviour, and particularly some of the work that I've done with people with disabilities, is try to express some of the views that I have gathered and some of the experiences that I've had as I researched people leaving buildings during evacuations, real fires that have occurred, and other work that we've done in this area. So the title of my presentation, Changing Demographics, Implications for Design and Management, really comes from a point and a context of changing demographics in society. Ragnar talked about people at risk. Our statistics will show us at the minute that are about 20 to 24% of the world's population have a disability, and 8 to 12% of those with a mobility impairment, which I guess when we talk about evacuation from buildings is only one of the many impairments that might limit your ability to evacuate, but for me it's the most critical one, in the sense that we still have a lot of issues I feel to deal with. We're an ageing society, and we know that the prevalence of disability increases with age, and the types of impairments, in fact, change as we age as well, with mobility becoming more prevalent. And we are also a more obese society. I have a graph there, I'll not go into detail, but across the world, if we don't intervene, people are becoming more obese, and that also has implications for society, not least because the prevalence of disability is higher among obese. It's about double that of the general population. So that's the context that we're working in. And I want to take us right back to 1976, maybe before some of you were born. But this was a statement that was made by a gentleman called Selwyn Goldsmith. You might not be familiar with him, but he was a real advocate for human rights for people with disabilities in the 1970s, a lobbyist at Parliament for access to buildings. He wrote a very seminal book called Designing for the Disabled. And in that book in 1976, he made this statement, which is not very politically correct today, but it was a statement he made all that time ago, and it said, "Buildings always have been and always will be geared to suit two-legged, able-bodied people and not people propped on sticks or rolling about in chairs on wheels." Not very politically correct, but I guess you get the sense of his frustration at that time as to where we were with regards to our design. And so what I really want to look at is, two questions. Is the design of our buildings appropriate for the populations of today and into the future? And is it realistically to assume that those populations can be safely managed? So I just want to bring up some issues as I see them, flick through them, and then maybe we can have a little discussion later, or as the day goes on, about more prevalent issues. I'm not familiar with the guidance exactly in Sweden or across the world. I'm familiar with some, but certainly when we look at the UK, what I can say is that our guidance with respect to how we design means of escape in buildings was developed at some point by a committee and are infrequently updated. I guess that's the situation in most countries. We certainly in the UK have very questionable underpinning assumptions. The main one of concern that's there being that in terms of our 5 millimetres per person exit width, which is how we design our means of escape provision, that we assume that they can move at a rate of 80 people per metre per minute through a door or downstairs. That is a very optimum flow that arose from studies of able-bodied people many, many years ago. And we also assume a holding capacity of 2 to 3 people per metre squared, and just a little slide on the right there shows you that that's not always the case. So we already are from a starting point of very questionable assumptions in some of our guidance, and I guess that's where some of the difficulties that I see with mixed ability populations, that I like to call them rather than thinking about disabled and able-bodied, of where we go with that. So what are the issues? First issue, very obvious one, reduced walking speeds. If we look at our design guide, that's PD 7974 in the UK, our fire engineering design guide, it suggested speeds of 0.6 to 1.1 metres per second on stairs. Now actually this is just this year, a few months ago, been updated to actually include lower speeds for people with disabilities. But as you can see in the table there, which includes some of my work, my PhD work, and other work by Fujiyama and Tyler and Erica Kulagowski at NIST, that those speeds that are in our design guides for fire engineers are often very much over predicting the speeds that are capable by many people in our society and people who are accessing and using buildings. The other thing about those speeds is that they were all collected over relatively short distances. Eric Kulagowski's work was over 13 stories, and what she saw was that people's speed reduced significantly over those 13 stories for older people moving, when we were looking at unimpeded speeds. But the other work was my work, for example, was only one flight of stairs. So, when we start to think about moving over longer distances, then fatigue becomes an issue, or may be an issue. It may be the fact that as we're in a vacuating population, that the natural stop-start of the flow gives people with disabilities that time to rest. But certainly we know very little little about the performance of people with mobility impairments over long distances. I know that Matthias has done some work ascending on stairs, but a lot of the work, and I guess for ethical reasons, maybe doesn't include the people that we really need the information on, the people who really have the difficulties in moving. We know that slower people will need to stop to rest. I find that in my work, and when we studied some of the evacuations in WTC on 9/11, and Erica, as I've already said, did show that the speed was likely to reduce over longer distances. So not only are people moving more slowly, but they will need to stop to rest. The diagram on the right there just shows, if I can use my my little pointer, which I don't seem to be working properly. That's it, not this screen, that's not what you see. You see up here. I'll get there. This is just a graph that was adapted from a study by IS, reported in Spearpoint, which asked people how long they could walk without stopping, and then relate it to their measured walking time. And you can see that as the walking speed is lower, then the time that they can walk before stopping is also lower. So this is an issue. And the implications of that are that they change evacuation dynamics, and can change evacuation dynamics very considerably. So no longer may we be thinking about this 80 people per metre per minute in the stairs. This is a quotation out of NIST's study of the evacuation on 9/11, where they reported that 51% of people they interviewed said that slower people moving on stairs were a constraint to their evacuation. So we're not just talking about the slower moving individuals here, we're talking about the whole people moving down the stairs. Now granted, those stairs in 9/11 were not designed for full evacuation, but there's still many stairs of those similar widths that might be in buildings today that people are moving down. And these are some of the just little quotes from people and the experiences that they had. We took up the entire width of the stairway and no one could get around us until we came to a landing. That was a gentleman assisting an overweight occupant, a person who was obese, down the stairs. If I just skip to the last one there, we took up the whole stairway going at a staccato pace. She would cuddle up to me and let people by. This is Susan, one of the girls that we interviewed, who was in the World Trade Center 1 on the 20th floor, talking about her sister who had to move in to let other people past. And that's, I guess, one of some of the other issue that we have is that people not only move more slowly, but they also take up more space. People using a mobility aid does not take up the same space as a person who's not using a mobility aid. Walking sticks, rollators, walking frames, wheelchair users, of course. Referring back to our movement towards being more obese, body ellipses are changing. One study suggested that we could be taking space of up to 0.44 metres squared, which is much greater than what we imagined we used to take. And there's a narrowing of the gap between the hip and the shoulder. So when we're designing buildings, we assume we're going to swing above the handrail. But now, if we're changing body shape, what does that do in terms of where we relocate ourselves relative to the handrail? When we have people moving that are slower moving or need assistance in stairs, obviously there's increased group size. That changes the dynamics of evacuation. The girl Susan that I just referred to a little moment ago had two assisters, one in front, one to the side, and one behind, that stayed with her during the whole evacuation. But she also referred to other people, about 5 or 6 people who'd come off the floor at the same time as her, who weren't in her immediate physically assisting group, that stayed with her, because people have this tendency to stick together, and that has been seen in other evacuations as well, that I've been aware of. And of course, when we get people needing assistance, then we get counterflows, as we did in 9/11 and as we've seen in many other evacuations. So all of a sudden, these stairs that we designed with an assumption of a flow and a holding capacity of, very optimum flow, a certain holding capacity, has a very, very different dynamic. And depending on the width of those stairs and the people moving them, and when the person with the disability or the slower moving people move into the stairs, that completely changes the dynamics of evacuation. So the question really for me is, are our stairs sufficient to accommodate mixed ability evacuation today, and will they be in the future, and what are the implications if they're not? The other thing that I wanted to mention is the fact that, of course, certainly in our guidance in the UK, and I guess elsewhere across the world, we do consider people with disabilities, and we do recognise that there are people who enter a building that can't use stairs. And we provide refuges, a temporarily safe space for people to wait before their onward assistance, either by assisted physically down stairs or using lifts. Our guidance certainly suggests the use of lifts, but it's not by any means compulsory, and I guess that's the same in other parts of the world. But our guidance suggests one refuge space for a wheelchair user, 900 by 1400 millimetres, to allow to manoeuvre in each protected stair at each level. That same guidance says that you can have 2 exits for up to 600 people, and we assume in our exit width that one's discounted. So that means essentially that you could have one refuge space for 600 people, and that isn't even reflective of the number of wheelchair users in our society today. It's nowhere near reflective of the number of wheelchair users or the percentage of wheelchair users in our society today. I believe in Sweden, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, it's one refuge space per 100 people. In our buildings. I don't have time to go into this in detail. I can talk to anybody about it later. But this was a situation that we had in 1990 in a museum building in Belfast. There was an Armada exhibition. A building that would normally have been used as art galleries now became an exhibition space with a flow coming here. This is the bottom right-hand corner, coming right round here, in here, round here and out here. There was an alarm set off by a toaster on the ground floor. They evacuated the building, and there just happened at the time of the alarm to be a group of people with disabilities, 4 wheelchair users, 5 others with disability and 3 carers at the front of the flow. Essentially what happened is they moved into the stair, into the refuge space. The landing would essentially be the refuge space in a building. But of course the refuge space wasn't sufficient for them. There just wasn't room for them. One of them did go down in the lift. The others were eventually assisted by staff down the stairs. But for a considerable period of time there was a lot of anxiety reported by the people trying to leave the stairs. There was an estimate of 600 people on this floor trying to get off, and because of the natural flows most of them are coming in this direction. And a lot of anxiety in a building that would have taken normally 3 minutes to evacuate took somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes. And that did not account for the third wheelchair user who actually abandoned his wheelchair, having not been confident about the assistance that the staff were giving him, and bumped his way down the stairs. And that is not the first time that has happened. There's other evidence that that is happening because of a lack of communication and confidence in the people that are trying to assist. So you can start to see how, if we're not designing our spaces properly and we have a changing demographic, how that can significantly impact evacuation. This is just a little quick illustration of the impact of a refuge. We design for one wheelchair user. What happens if we have another wheelchair? And this is just a little graphic actually that Pete Thompson, who was speaking yesterday, created in Simulx for me, just to show the difference in time that it takes, the impact that's going to have on the flow. But of course, we don't just design for wheelchair users. It's not just wheelchair users that need to use a refuge, as the museum evacuation showed. There's older people. If you're a person who's with a person in a wheelchair, you're not going to, in the event of a fire, just wheel them into the refuge and walk off, are you? You're not going to abandon them there in the refuge. So we need to be sizing our refuges differently for how they're going to be used. On 9/11, there was a report, I think by one of the fire officers, that said that there was a floor, the actual floor's pretty not quite known, but they reckoned that the people that were on that floor, a rest floor, only comprised about 50% of people who had a mobility impairment. The other 50 were people who were there with them and assisting them and staying with them. So we need to think about how we're designing our refuges. And I guess my other question is, are those refuges sufficient? And I think from what I'm saying to you, I think you get where I'm going with this, but I'll let you make up your own mind. The final issue really is management. I could talk all day about this. We had a study in the UK, the Department of Communities and Local Government, and they did a study looking at refuge areas and their management, and this was the conclusion. The management of evacuation procedures, including refuges and their alternatives, requires a major overhaul, and that was long after legislation in the UK that requires owners, occupiers to do their risk assessments and have responsibility for managing their buildings. On 9/11, the NIST study concluded that mobility impaired occupants were not not universally accounted for by existing evacuation procedures. The girl Susan that I mentioned earlier on had a disability. She actually wheeled herself around in a secretary's chair with wheels. She used a walking aid, and she had no plan for her evacuation. Now, she enacted a plan at the time, but there was no forward planning for her evacuation. And what we see time and time again when we look at the evidence is a lack of training, and that can lead to injury. This little photograph on the right-hand side is a study that we did in a film theatre where the member of staff didn't communicate with the wheelchair. The gentleman using the wheelchair, he assumed he was going to catch him as he tipped his wheelchair to go up the stairs, and he fell out of his chair. So there are injuries. That there wasn't an injury in this case, but there are injuries that can occur, and there is a real need for training in this. There are issues, I know, with manual handling and the difficulties for staff, but we need staff who are trained and who can communicate. The gentleman in the Ulster Museum who abandoned his wheelchair. I met that gentleman actually on another occasion in other work that I was doing. The staff that we'd interviewed initially said the man was very difficult. He refused to be helped. The gentleman himself said, I had watched 2 of my friends being manhandled down the stairs by people who didn't know what they were doing, and for me the safest option was to get out of my chair and bump my way down the stairs. So there's a real need to communicate during the procedures and communicate procedures to those who need to use them. Because there is a real lack of understanding among users of what a refuge is. This is a study, I'll not go into it in detail now, but we found that 60% of people with disabilities who would need to use a refuge who couldn't use stairs didn't know what a refuge was. So if we're designing buildings with systems and things in place to assist somebody and the users don't know what they are, then why and how are they going to use them? Physical escape, I've noticed my time and I will be very quick. Assisted escape is very physically demanding. It takes up a lot of time. We can't assume that the assistive devices that we put in buildings are going to be used easily. I refer to an evacuation of John Abruzzo, who was in 9/11. You may have seen him he's been on the media. He was assisted by 10 people taking him down the stairs. 10 people, not one person that some of the media would lead you to believe. 10 people taking it in turns to get him down the stairs, and he got out 5 minutes before WTC 1 collapsed, 1 hour 46 minutes from impact. So this is considerable manpower, or requires considerable manpower, and it is a real challenge. I'm not pretending it's not, but it's a challenge that we have to take on board. Lifts are the solution. I'm not going to go into that now, or are part of the solution, or could be part of the solution. And it was interesting yesterday when Kathleen was talking about the fire safety ecosystem, about the financial implications. And I guess ironically, many years ago, access to buildings wasn't given for people with disabilities because there was a perceived cost with that. We've moved on from that. Now there's a perceived cost with lifts, and maybe someday we'll move on from that as well. So just to finish, the challenge is for all of us, and again I'll go back to Kathleen. Yesterday I prepared these slides before, and I heard you talking, and nearly every one of my points here relates into one of the things that you talked about, Kathleen. There are easily identifiable scenarios in my mind where safety could really be seriously compromised if we don't start to address the issue now and into the future. In the Ulster Museum, if there had been a fire on the floor on that day, there would have been deaths. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever about it. And unfortunately, I hope we don't get to the stage where something like that happens until we start to take action. But it requires action from all of us. Code developers to think about whether our provision is sufficient. Enforcers to ensure that the guidance is being followed. In our guidance, we suggest communication in a refuge area. I know that that's not being followed. And with technology today, there's no reason why that can't be happening. Fire engineers to develop realistic occupancy profiles and use the worst credible evacuation scenarios. We use the worst credible fire scenarios. Why are we not using the worst credible evacuation scenarios? Researchers, I'm one of them, to develop our understanding of mixed ability evacuation and be able to quantify for use by engineers. Modelers to be able to accommodate the complexity of evacuation when they're modelling. Management to do all the things that management are supposed to be doing, which is a real challenge. And also building users, people to engage, to be educated and to engage in the process because they have a responsibility as well. I'm really sorry for going over time, I know I have, so I apologise and I thank you for your attention.
So, my name is Lynn Ranåker and I work at Region South Fire and Rescue Service and I'm an analyst strategist there. Before I started at the Rescue Service, I was working at Lund University as doing research in biology and how fish interacted with each other and how climate change affected that. And then the Fire and Rescue Service hired me. So now I try to combine what you're doing, the researchers, and take that into our world, how we actually can use it. So do we have anyone from the Fire and Rescue Service in here? Good. Perfect. Because I will mainly speak to you, but I think that the researcher can add on and maybe see, oh, maybe we can do research on this. Yeah. Demography, is it just a buzzword or something that we can use in the Fire and Rescue Service today? We have many different factors that we actually have to look upon to try to prevent the next accident. Men and women, because we know that men are more likely to end up in an accident also. And we also have to think about when people are born or when they're dying and about the age. We have to think about the whole population and if you have disabilities and others. One thing we know also is really important when we come to fire is the money. How much money do you have? And what is your income? What kind of house do you have? Do you live in the city center or do you live out on the countryside like I do? What kind of sports you're doing can reflect how if you're active or you're non-active. That will also affect the health. You talked a lot about it. So if you're like me, you can move around, you will be less likely to end up dead in a fire. Educational level. We also seen that from research. Depending on which educational level, you will also be more or less likely to end up in a fire or actually die in a fire. Crime. We know that some fires, they're not just happening when we're cooking or unintentionally. It's actually someone that starts the fire with an intention to hurt someone else. So there are quite many factors, and then we have this. Is it only an accident when we have a fire? And we know that, no, it's not. So we have to look at different factors here to try to combine all these factors, put the layers on layers, so we can actually prevent the next fire from happening or some other accidents. Are you with me on this one? So you have to start building this layer. You cannot only look at one factors, because then you will not go in the right direction where you have to do the best prevention work. And also when you look at demography, you can look at many different levels. So here you have the whole world. That's one part of the demography. But you have to scale that down. So now we have Sweden. You have different regions here. And for those who don't know, I'm working down here on the white parts. Skåne, and we have Burlöv, Eslöv, Kävlinge, Lund, and Malmö. And we try to prevent fires and other accidents down here by using these layers to see where we have to be. And we have this population, because the population, that's the one that starts the fire, so we have to interact with them the whole time to understand what is actually going on here. I'll try to speed it up because I also thought your presentation was really important for us. So we have Skåne, and we have our municipalities, and we have people living here. And depending on where these people live and their economies are and what they're working with and so on, we will have different risk factors. So you can point down at the small square in one of the cities, and we know that here is a bigger risk for something to happen, or bigger chance for something to happen, compared to if you just move like 1 kilometer away, and the risk can be really different. And one thing with the demography is also that's changing the whole time. So we have people migrating into Sweden, but we also have people migrating within Sweden. So every year we increase our population in our municipality with at least 1%. That means with 5,000 more people in our region every year. That's 50,000 in 10 years. So it's quite a lot. And we have to be aware of who's moving in here, because it's the person that makes the accident. And we have to be aware on all these factors. What kind of new factors do we have? I will just show that in this picture that we have changed in the fire and rescue service, of course. This is a picture from Motala, I think it was, where you used to have these horses going out, and now we have the bigger fire trucks going out. So we try to be with what's happening out there. While things are changing in our city, this is Gustav Adolfs torg. And it was so fun when I found this picture, because there are so many people out there walking around. I would say that people are more maybe inside now. That's also one thing, one factor that we have to think about. And also that we have a more complex building. We don't have this H&M house in this picture, but I can say this picture here, if you just look, if you would go a bit over there, there is a big bus, you have many cars. So much more is going on there. So many more risk factors, but also that you have all this complex building. And what does this complex building means when we have a fire? Will they be able to get out from the house nowadays? And more likely to have more people in there as well. So the composition of the humans being here, we have to be really aware of who's here to be able to rescue them when something happens or prevent the accident. So as a fire and rescue service, we have a lot of challenges. We have the law saying that we need to prevent accidents, fires. We need to respond to it. And then we have to start to think about what will we prevent and how will we prevent it. And in the response, it's quite easy. We need to be fast and efficient. And we have to think about all these factors every time when we want to answer some of these questions. So when we want to prevent an accident, it's really good for the fire and rescue service to look at the data the whole time, so we don't end up with the increasing trend of a fire. So we want to stop them. And if we are here, we could see, okay, now we have an increasing trend in the fires. Why is that so? Is something happening with the demography out there, or something that the factors are changing? And quite many times we can say, yes, it is. Sometimes we have elderly population in buildings, and they're not able to handle cooking anymore. So that could actually be that we can see in this area now we have more fires in the kitchens. So then we can start our prevention work in that building and the area around it. And we can also see that there will be an effect of it. But there are also so many other factors that we need to take into this aspect, and also start to think about what can we do as a fire and rescue service, what can others do, and what can we do together. And we talked about it earlier today, that we as a fire and rescue service, we really need to work, cooperate with so many others today to be able to handling what we are supposed to be handling, taking care of you all out there when things are not going well. And then we have to think about being efficient and being fast. So when we ask people, what do you expect from us as a fire and rescue service? And I was talking to a couple of days ago here at the conference, and said, people want us to be fast and nice. And I think it summarizes it quite good, because that's what people expect from us. And how can you be fast? A fire, as you talked about, is dynamic. So you have to be there quite quick to just having a small fire, so it will not grow large. So someone have to take care of the fire. So if we have a fire here, we have a station here, it might take 5 minutes, 10 minutes for us to get there. And then we need to start think about how can we recruit people to go to actually work here. But maybe we should put on another layer. How can we find people closer in the society that are volunteers that could actually do this first help? And there can also demography help us. Let's see, it's on this picture as well. So then we can look at, so what are the age in this area, age range in this area? So let's say around here. So we have this red spot here. This is just made up numbers, but just to show you how you can use demography, and also how I have been doing. So I got a question a couple of years ago. So if we put a fire station here, are we able to recruit? Who's living in the area? So then I did something like this. So I looked at who's living in this area, and here you have the age. So if you find something like this, you can say that could be quite hard to recruit here, because you have an elderly population. But if it would look more like this, then I would say, could be quite good to have a fire station here, or there will be people volunteering. Maybe you find more volunteering up here, because here you have more time to do volunteering. So you can use people differently depending on which age group you will find. And then you also have to look at, okay, we want to have a part-time station. What else can we look at? Are people working close to where they live? So how many of the people living up here are working close to their homes? And depending on the outcome here, you can put, again, layers and layers and try to figure out, will we be able to recruit in our area? So we can respond fast to the accident. So here, if you use this information, the municipality has it, and it's there. So just ask for it, and you will be able to use that in your everyday life while you're working. And you will be more efficient in how you're doing your prevention work, and also being fast and efficient. Are you with me on this one? How many of you, that's from the Fire and Rescue Service, use data to try to prevent accidents? Yeah, I saw your presentation yesterday, sir. That's good. Perfect. So we have some using this. So just to go back to this, is demography just a buzzword? I would say that if we as a fire and rescue service will be efficient and use the money well that we're getting from our municipalities, we start to need to use demography much more, all these factors, to put these layers, to be able to help the one that we're supposed to help and be fast, efficient, and prevent the accident. Because we don't want to end up with this silver gray generation, the old men and ladies ending up in a fire and they're dying. Because then we need to work more together. I would like that, but hopefully we will not have anyone more in my region that are dying from a house fire. So thank you a lot for listening.
Together. Thank you so much. I feel like we have been peeling off layers of an onion here, starting with us and our differences, and all the barriers that we need, and the design of our buildings, and the design of the society, including the fire service. So it's many layers that really need to correlate and work together. So thank you very much. Very, very, very good presentations. Do we have any questions or reflections out there?
Thank you. Question for Karen, actually. And you mentioned Peter's and his group's presentation yesterday. But just circling back, and this actually may be for all of you as speakers, but I'm focusing towards you because you mentioned it. But I'm curious if you're aware of any research that's ongoing that's utilizing artificial intelligence, video image recognition techniques, and some other newer technologies on crowd movement to bring back towards evacuation modeling, never mind for crowd management strategies and so forth. So are you aware of any research in that regard?
Actually, I can talk about a piece of research that's funded by Brandforsk at the minute. Pete's involved with Håkon Francis and originally Daniel Nielsen at NIST, at Lund. Daniel's now in New Zealand. But and I've been an advisor to that project. The project I mentioned to you with Rita there, we are trying to look at new technologies, and that's using like sensor technologies that would be used in biomechanics to look more closely at people movement and try and understand more closely how exactly people interact with one another. What happens at the minute in a lot of models is that we're imposing a speed density relationship onto, you work out where somebody is, you work out the density, then there's a certain speed, and that's how it evolves. So what we're trying to do in that project is develop an emergent model of movement. I did some work with a biomechanist back home looking at, it was actually older people moving on a treadmill, not very, externally valid perhaps, but we showed statistically that older people, one, moved more slowly, clearly, than younger group, and also chose to locate themselves at a different distance behind the person in front, I guess, to be able to react, obviously, to any changes in the movement. So we move differently. You can go down to whatever level you want, and it's very complex, this movement. I'm aware of some work that I think that Ed Galea was doing. I think it was part of a European project looking at utilising in real time CCTV footage to capture where people were, and then to feed that information dynamically into a model which would reassess the situation and optimise, and then feed back into directional exit signage. So I think that we need to start really to look at technology at every layer, how it can be used to better understand movement, and also how it can be better used to inform and educate people that do need our assistance, and locate them and communicate with them and whatever.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. I have a question for Karen. I remember reading an article a while back about the fact that why can't students be more like the general population? I mean, we use students a lot for the studies that we do in terms of evacuation, or in terms of all sorts of different studies, just because of the fact that they're so accessible for the researchers. Do you have a good strategy for how we could access other groups so that we can get good data, say, for disabled movement and others?
I don't have a strategy per se, but I think it's a very important point that when we're any studies that we do tend to use students because they're easy, and the same problem relates into, I didn't mention it, is the way we conduct drills in buildings as well. Because when we conduct a drill, we exclude very often the very people who could be part of showing us how complex and what the problems are in a building. We have worked with disability action groups before, and the picture that I showed you of the gentleman falling out of his wheelchair, we worked with a group called Disability Action, and the people were very willing and wanted to come and be involved in that evacuation that we did. So it is possible, but there's lots of ethical issues, I guess, and I alluded to this earlier on, and I'm sure Matthias has come across this as well, in everything that we do, because we always have to balance that, the benefits of the research to the risk associated to the people that we're involving in the research. And I had a PhD student, actually she's taken some time out at the minute, but we still hope to come back to it, who was really wanting to push the boundaries about the types of people that she involved in her research. And we'd actually talked about doing some of the research and movement space in a hospital, which I know some of the health sciences people do in our university. first day using stairs in hospital. So you did actually have medical attention right there to get over some of the ethical issues about pushing people to the, like for example, the idea of fatigue and how far you can walk on stairs. If you're pushing an elderly person, to get the data that you really need, there's lots of issues associated with that. So I don't have a strategy, but certainly I think that we should all as researchers be aiming to get the most, a valid population. And that again also relates then into the use of that when engineers should be using and models should be able to accommodate these really diverse populations that we have. Because if we don't do that, we're not dealing with the critical situations that might occur, and I think we should be managing and designing for.
Thanks. Thank you for your lectures. We obviously have a lot of work to do to help people with disabilities being able to evacuate safely. I was wondering if you could give us any tips on what do you think the rescue services should focus on in our preventive work? Karen, I was talking to.
Oh,
sorry. But maybe both of you can answer the question.
There's a number of aspects. I mean, I can sort of tell you some of the work that we're doing in Northern Ireland. I mean, I guess what I was talking about was mainly designing but the design of buildings, public buildings for people with disabilities, for our mixed demographic that we have. With respect to dwellings, I know that in Northern Ireland I've got a student who is actually a firefighter who's doing a part-time PhD, and what he's doing is, we mentioned that the numbers of fires are going down. Sorry, numbers of fires aren't going down. The numbers of fires are going down, but we're still dying in fires. And he's trying to identify those at-risk groups and then trying to have tailored programs for those. Now, when I say for them, for example, the group he's looking at the minute is elderly people, and he started out his PhD looking at how can we better educate elderly. And I was talking to someone yesterday, forgive me, but I can't remember, that there are fire services who bring elderly people into the fire station and they do all sorts of training and things with them. But what he's doing is taking a slightly different type, because the people that are the most vulnerable in our view are not the people who will sign up to going and doing something like that. They're the people that don't answer the door to the fire service when they come around knocking to do a fire safety check. So what we're trying to do, or what he's trying to do, is to look at how we can work with the people that are in close contact with those individuals. So when we looked at our statistics in Northern Ireland, we found that of 99% of elderly people who died in fires had at least one person that they were in contact with. Even if they lived alone, they might have been isolated in one respect, had people they were in contact with, and in many cases when you went back into the coroner's reports, had people had noticed these risky behaviours that they were engaging in with dementia and all different things, but weren't equipped to deal with it, couldn't get the person to change that behaviour. So what we're trying to do is come at I think we need to be, we need to be cute about which angles we come at it, and come at it from a different angle and try and equip those people, understand what those risky behaviours are, equip the other people that are surrounding the at-risk groups, not necessarily, yes, them themselves, but not necessarily just them, the people also that can intervene and the situation, because I think it is a societal thing. It's not just, it's not the fire service's responsibility. The individuals maybe can't take the responsibility themselves. I think we all have a responsibility to try and change things. Lynn, you might have some other.
I can just agree on what you're saying.
Me too.
Yes, that is and that is excellent advice for residence fires. Do you have any specific advice for fires in public buildings and so on?
I don't know what the situation is in Sweden. Mm-hmm. In the UK, it's certainly the responsibility of management to have planned for the evacuation of all of the people. Is that the same in Sweden? And I know there were cases in the UK when we had a fire brigade strike many years ago, when people were actually being refused entry to buildings because they were being told, well, there's a strike and we can't get you out if you come in. So I guess my only advice would be to, and it's very difficult because in Northern Ireland, I know in terms of our we have ongoing management of buildings, and the fire service have to police that. But they tend to look at the buildings that they deem to be most at risk. But the challenges are not necessarily in those buildings that are most at risk, because often they know they're at risk and they have the procedures and management in place. It's often the smaller buildings, a small office building or a small shop or something like that, where actually the people aren't aware and think, oh, nothing will happen here. So I'm skirting around the question. I don't really have a solution, I guess, where possible to liaise with the buildings where you do perceive there to be maybe large groups of people where you would expect there to be difficulties, and try and work with them to try and help them develop those procedures and to work with them as to terms of what's required. But it's not an easy fix. It's really difficult. It is a real challenge, I think, for everybody.
Well, thank you so much. And you're going to give some presents here. And please thank our speakers.